Hello everyone, this is Jed Shlackman. I work as a holistic mental health counselor and energy healer. For this video I'm covering the topic of ADD or ADHD and looking over the medical model, so examining how conventional medicine and psychiatry tend to define and treat the concerns that receive that label or diagnosis of attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So we'll kind of deconstruct this whole process of how things are defined and diagnosed and the conceptions behind all that and the treatments that are used. This is somewhat of a complex subject with lots of layers and nuance to it. So I hope you can all follow along and kind of keep up and understand these different aspects of these phenomena as I share them. And what we're going to do to begin is just read through a very typical medical explanation of ADHD. So we'll start out by looking through what's on the website of the CDC. So the CDC is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention here in the United States. And if you consider the name of that agency, they're looking at things from a disease perspective. So they're looking at any particular disease or disorder from that perception of pathology, right? That there's something diseased or disordered present. So on their website they say here, what is ADHD in the title? And we'll scroll down through here. They state that ADHD is one of the most common neurodevelopmental disorders of childhood. It is usually first diagnosed in childhood and often lasts into adulthood. Children with ADHD may have trouble paying attention, controlling impulsive behaviors. They may act without thinking about what the result will be, or be overly active. So let's start out with just that first paragraph there. They refer to it as a neurodevelopmental disorder of childhood. So neuro and developmental. Developmental has to do with the stages of development. So here it's something that's being diagnosed in childhood when we're going through that process of development. And neuro implies it relates to the nervous system. So they're looking at it through the lens or perspective of the brain and nervous system, trying to draw that connection that behaviors are being governed or controlled by the brain, the activity of the nervous system, which is actually just one small fragment or facet of a much more expansive system that includes our emotions, our thoughts and beliefs, our environment, our social relationships, our biological environment. All of those things are part of this really expanded system that in some way creates any particular condition that might get labeled as disorder or disease diagnosis. So people often think, well, this is something wrong with my brain. My brain is just somehow wired differently as a result of genetics, and this is why I'm acting or reacting or functioning in a certain pattern or way. And that's not really an accurate way to look at it. It contains some valuable kernels of truth, perhaps, because your brain certainly is part of what's unfolding, part of this overall system. But what's influencing the brain, what's triggering those patterns of activity in the brain, that's leading you to function in any particular way. So it's a lot more complex than just the simple equation of thinking there's something disordered with your brain that's making you feel or act a certain way. And of course, the descriptions of what you observe in those children, trouble paying attention, controlling impulsive behaviors, being overly active. So these are all things that kind of consist of looking at a continuum. So some children may be very active, hyperactive, which is the source of that term, while other children may be very low activity, very kind of passive or extra calm. And behavior can exist anywhere on that continuum. There isn't really a clear black and white dividing line of being an active child or an inactive child, and it can vary from one time to another, from one environment to another, from 1 month to another. So it's not something that's very discrete or concrete. It's very fluid and flexible. And all of the symptoms that are looked at as defining attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder are things that you can observe from time to time in people that are not labeled with those disorders. So it's not like there's a particular behavior that's exclusive or specific to ADD. These are things that could appear in anyone. It's just that if you chronically and extensively display a particular pattern, then you may end up with a diagnosis. So if it's seeming to be present in your experience, quote unquote, too much, then it's looked upon as a pathology or disorder. But it's not that there's a behavior that only appears in children with ADD. It's not that there's a particular image of brain activity that you could see on a scan that would only ever appear in a child with ADHD. So that's why it's somewhat subjective in terms of how these might be diagnosed, and why there's a lot of controversy both over the diagnosis and approaches to treating these particular mental health diagnostic labels. So next, the CDC in their article states that the signs and symptoms of ADHD are as follows. It is normal for children to have trouble focusing and behaving at one time or another. However, children with ADHD do not just grow out of these behaviors. These symptoms continue, can be severe, and can cause difficulty at school, at home, or with friends. So a significant part is, are these particular symptoms causing problems in your life? Is it interfering with your functioning in your family, in your school, in your workplace, etc.? A child with ADHD might, and here's their symptom list, daydream a lot, forget or lose things a lot, squirm or fidget, talk too much, make careless mistakes or take unnecessary risks, have a hard time resisting temptation, have trouble taking turns, have difficulty getting along with others. So those are all different symptoms that are all kind of clumped together to create this diagnosis. All of those particular symptoms might appear at certain times for any child or any person. So we all might have times where we are daydreaming more than we want to, or we're feeling kind of restless or fidgety, or making mistakes or being impulsive. And often these types of things appear when we are under stress of some kind. So it's kind of like this overstressed state that we get into, or an overactivation or overstimulation of our nervous system. it's kind of well known that when you're in a rush, when you're stressed, you're more likely to have accidents, right? So think of this child being labeled with ADHD, that's making a lot of mistakes, that's forgetting things a lot. Well, perhaps they are feeling a lot of stress or anxiety, and that's contributing to this state of neurological activity, which in turn is contributing to those types of symptoms or behaviors. Coming back to the CDC article, types. So there are subtypes of ADHD that are diagnosed. There are 3 different ways ADHD presents itself, depending on which types of symptoms are strongest in the individual. There's predominantly inattentive presentation, where it's hard for the individual to organize or finish a task, hard to pay attention to details or to follow instructions or conversations. The person is easily distracted or forgets details of daily routines. So that is someone who you might look upon as the more daydreamy type, who seems to kind of zone out and isn't paying attention. Their mind is kind of focused somewhere else. Then there's a predominantly hyperactive, impulsive presentation. The person fidgets and talks a lot. It's hard to sit still for long, e.g. for a meal or while doing homework. Smaller children may run, jump, or climb constantly. The individual feels restless and has trouble with impulsivity. Someone who is impulsive may interrupt others a lot, grab things from people, or speak at inappropriate times. It's hard for the person to wait their turn or listen to directions. A person with impulsiveness may have more accidents and injuries than others. Now, if we look at children and childhood development, we observe that as children grow older, they tend to develop more impulse control. So they react less impulsively as they mature and become older. If a child is not maturing, if they're not developing as expected in that way, then you'll see more of the earlier childhood type of behaviors present. We know that stress kind of stunts childhood growth and development. It's kind of keeping someone in a state of arrested development where they're reacting more from the stress coping mechanisms of a younger age. So that's correlated in a way with the idea of this being neurodevelopmental. So if you're not developing and maturing ideally, often due to stresses, then your nervous system will appear to show different predominant patterns of activity. And then the third diagnosed subtype of ADHD is the combined presentation, where symptoms of both of the above types, of the inattentive and hyperactive types, are equally present in the person. Because symptoms can change over time, the presentation may change over time as well. Next, they talk about ideas on causes of ADHD, and this is their summary. Scientists are studying causes and risk factors in an effort to find better ways to manage and reduce the chances of a person having ADHD. I would say people are exhibiting or expressing symptoms that are labeled as ADHD. It's not necessarily something you have or possess. It's not defining who you are, and it's not something that necessarily is going to be long-lasting or permanent, depending on how you address the causal factors. So coming back from that aside, the causes and risk factors for ADHD are unknown, but current research shows that genetics plays an important role. Recent studies link genetic factors with ADHD. So I'll pause there to comment some more. What actually is genetics? So we think of genetics as the transmission of some pattern of form or function from one generation to another. So if your parents or other ancestors were under stress and that stress caused them or triggered them to develop some form of adaptation of how they could handle that to cope best with it in the time and environment that they existed, then there's a memory of that now within the organism that's transferred through the genetics to future generations. So genetics is a way for adaptations to be passed on to enable the survival or the functioning of future generations. So it's not necessarily, or it's not even accurate in a sense to think of them as aberrations or flaws. They're actually designed to benefit the individual and the species. So if you have a quote-unquote disease or disorder that's being looked upon as at least partly genetic in its origin, consider that those symptoms are actually serving some positive purpose from the point of view of the species or the organism. So the functioning that we're labeling as pathology or as a disease or disorder is actually a reaction to some form of stress or challenge. It's an adaptation of some form that actually serves a useful purpose in some contexts. So we react to stress in certain ways that are actually useful and valuable, at least to some extent. We might get stuck. We might be chronically in that pattern of reaction where it becomes a challenge, where it becomes something that's inhibiting our well-being. But the original purpose of those particular patterns was actually for one's benefit. So that's a way I like to explain genetics and the role that they can play. And of course, if you have parents or grandparents or ancestors who display certain patterns of functioning, there is a likelihood that under similar types of stresses or circumstances, it will trigger you to react or respond in similar ways, since you've carried those adaptations that your parents or other ancestors had developed. And that's not really a bad thing, but you want to understand what's going on there so that perhaps you can develop newer strategies, newer ways to adapt, and perhaps you could also reduce those stresses so you're not being overwhelmed by stress as much, and you won't display those reactions so much, thereby perhaps resolving whatever disease or disorder you've been labeled with. So we'll continue now in this section on causes of ADHD. In addition to genetics, scientists are studying other possible causes and risk factors, including, and the list here is brain injury, exposure to environmental risks such as lead during pregnancy or at a young age, alcohol and tobacco use during pregnancy, premature delivery, and low birth weight. So these are things that either place some kind of stress on the individual or which disrupt or interfere with psychological and biological development. It says here, research does not support the popularly held views that ADHD is caused by eating too much sugar, watching too much television, parenting, or social and environmental factors such as poverty or family chaos. Then the next sentence says, of course, many things, including these, might make symptoms worse, especially in certain people. But the evidence is not strong enough to conclude that they are the main causes of ADHD. So really you have a convergence of multiple levels and layers of causal factors. So it's hard to say one specific trigger or factor is the cause of ADHD. It's really multifaceted and multidimensional. So there are many children out there eating tons of sugar and they're not reacting or showing the pattern of ADHD symptomatology, while there might be a subset of children who kind of get triggered or pushed over the edge when they're exposed to a lot of sugar. So we have to look at each individual as an individual and see what are the constellation or collection of factors that are present for that specific person that are contributing to the pattern of functioning or behavior that we're observing for them. And with that understanding, we can see that an intervention that's helping one person might not make a difference for another person. So we have to consider individualizing the therapeutic approaches and treatments, looking at a person in a holistic way as that person's biology, their emotions, their beliefs, their spiritual source, their family environment, their neighborhood, their biological environment. All of these things are relevant factors, and if we ignore multiple factors that are relevant, we're less likely to find valuable and effective sorts of interventions or treatments. And here we come to the CDC article talking about diagnosis. Deciding if a child has ADHD is a process with several steps. And we'll keep in mind that all of these several steps are not always followed in the healthcare field when the diagnosis is being given. There is no single test to diagnose ADHD, and many other problems like anxiety, depression, sleep problems, and certain types of learning disabilities can have similar symptoms. So there's an overlap between symptoms that are used to diagnose one particular disorder with other disorders. So the same symptom could be related to a variety of these syndromes or patterns that are observed in the population. One step of the process involves having a medical exam, including hearing and vision tests, to rule out other problems with symptoms like ADHD. So there's the sense that having a certain medical issue could contribute to the symptoms that are often looked upon as ADHD symptoms. And you could use an example of hearing and vision. So if someone has a difficulty with their hearing, it's hard for them to understand people, then it could appear like they're not listening, they're not paying attention. And someone who doesn't know they have a hearing issue could unwittingly give them an ADHD label, thinking that's the problem when it's actually how they're reacting to their difficulty with hearing. So there's the medical testing that could be done. Diagnosing ADHD usually includes a checklist for rating ADHD symptoms and taking a history of the child from parents, teachers, and sometimes the child. So they will try to rule out the known medical conditions that could create symptoms that might be mistaken as ADHD, and Then there's the psychological symptom checklist, or you could say it's a behavioral symptom checklist, looking at the signs of inattention and signs of impulsivity and hyperactivity. That's a rating system that's given to parents and teachers, and depending on the age level, it could be also given to the child. That's obviously a subjective measure where someone is observing and saying how frequently or often they're noticing certain types of behavior patterns. So it's not a purely objective, empirical type of measurement. So to diagnose ADHD and ADD, there actually isn't a very clear-cut, objective, empirical instrument. There are these more subjective measures. There are people in the medical field who've attempted to correlate those ADHD symptom patterns with biological patterns, with the activity that can be observed in the brain, such as electrical activity and neurotransmitter levels and things of that nature. But that's not really a complete definitive way to observe this, because anyone at any time can show a pattern in their brain related to a certain state that they're in where certain behaviors appear, and so it's not something that would appear exclusively to an ADHD person. It's something that could appear in anyone depending on what state they're in, whether they're calm, stressed out, etc. So it's hard to really diagnose things in a completely objective way. There's always going to be some form of subjectivity when you're creating a diagnostic label in mental health. Now we're coming to the section in the CDC article on treatments. In most cases, ADHD is best treated with a combination of behavioral therapy and medication. For preschool-age children, 4 to 5 years of age with ADHD, behavior therapy, particularly training for parents, is recommended as the first line of treatment before medication is tried. What works best can depend on the child and family. Good treatment plans will include close monitoring, follow-ups, and making changes if needed along the way. Now, here is where I'd like to really go in depth because they just mentioned two specific categories or modalities of treatment. When out in the field of ADHD care and treatment, there's people practicing literally dozens of different treatment approaches, resources, and interventions. So somehow in the medical model, they've created their consensus that only these two particular forms of therapy are recommended or considered effective for addressing the ADHD symptoms. At the same time, they will tell people that there's no quote-unquote cure for ADHD, so they're just treating or managing the symptoms with their behavioral interventions and pharmacological interventions. In terms of research on ADHD, there's actually tens of thousands of studies out there looking into the diagnosis, the etiology, and treatment of ADD and ADHD, and many of those studies have found significant value and benefit in other forms of therapy or intervention beyond just those two that the CDC is mentioning here. So in the field of psychology and psychotherapy, it's not only behavior therapy that's out there. There are different forms of cognitive therapy, psychodynamic therapy, family therapy, art therapy, music therapy, sound therapy, narrative therapy, movement therapy. There are also things like meditation and mindfulness therapy, exercise, nature, yoga therapy. I could go on for a pretty long time making a list of all the different healing modalities that are out there that at least some people are finding are benefiting those with ADD or ADHD symptoms. So it's rather limiting and somewhat disingenuous for the CDC and other people presenting the medical model to only talk about or only recommend drug therapies and behavior therapies, which in a sense are focused on superficial levels of two different domains of our being. So you have the physiological or biological domain, which is what medications are targeting, and the way they're targeting it is by inserting into your body a particular chemical compound that's designed to interfere with the normal mechanisms of balancing things that the body itself has, to kind of forcibly increase or elevate or decrease or suppress the activity of our own natural neurotransmitters or hormones. So in the case of the ADD and ADHD symptoms, they're prescribing medications that are primarily intended to increase the activity of a neurotransmitter dopamine in our body. That's the one that's heightened when we're in a state of heightened alertness. So when we're stimulated, we have more dopamine active in our receptors in our brain. We need that at certain times. It's a natural part of our functioning to have these levels fluctuate, to be high at certain times of the day, lower at other times of the day. When you're asleep, you'll naturally have very little dopamine active because you don't need your brain alert in that way. It needs to rest so you can be refreshing and recharging as you sleep. So everyone actually goes through many different states of activity of their brain throughout the day. There isn't any particular state that's inherently normal or abnormal. It's just that when you have too much stress, you might be in certain states extensively more than quote-unquote normal or average. The solution is not to take a medication, perhaps, but to actually change your lifestyle, change your habits, or build greater skills for coping with or managing stress. So we kind of want to look at how we're processing these things and how we're approaching them. And being more flexible or more open in terms of what we can consider as potential interventions to balance ourselves, and if you're working with children, to help them have more balance, to help them develop skills to adapt better to different circumstances in their lives or their environment. If you just give a medication to force a child into a state of greater alertness or focus, you're not teaching that child skills to manage their own state of mental activity and focus. In general, whether we're children or adults, we often don't have these skills well developed. We've gotten accustomed often to using a medication or using food or coffee or other things to control how we're feeling, how we're acting, rather than building some deeper resources for handling how we relate to our environment, how we function in the world around us. We'll come now to the CDC article once again, and this time their headline is Managing Symptoms, Staying Healthy. It says here, being healthy is important for all children and can be especially important for children with ADHD. In addition to behavioral therapy and medication, having a healthy lifestyle can make it easier for your child to deal with ADHD symptoms. Here are some healthy behaviors that may help. Developing healthy eating habits, such as eating plenty of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, and choosing lean protein sources, participating in daily physical activity based on age, limiting the amount of daily screen time from TVs, computers, phones, and other electronics, getting the recommended amount of sleep each night based on age. So clearly they're acknowledging that all of those factors can play a role in how you're functioning. And for many of those who have received an ADD or ADHD label, if you really truly address those issues, you may have those symptoms go away, essentially. So they're creating this false dichotomy of treatment being the medications and behavioral therapy, and these other things is just like general things to support your health as a complement, when in reality these other aspects of healthy lifestyle can actually be core fundamental parts of treatment and often are shown to produce just as positive benefits, at least in the short term, as behavioral and medication treatments. The last thing they say is to get help, so they want you to go ahead and see professionals. It says if you or your doctor has concerns about ADHD, you can take your child to a specialist such as a child psychologist, child psychiatrist, or developmental pediatrician, or you can contact your local early intervention agency for children under 3 or a public school for children 3 and older. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, funds the National Resource Center on ADHD, a program of CHADD, C-H-A-D-D, the organization Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Their website has links to information for people with ADHD and their families. The National Resource Center operates a call center with trained staff to answer questions about ADHD. They also have a section on ADHD in adults. ADHD can last into adulthood. Some adults have ADHD but have never been diagnosed. The symptoms can cause difficulty at work, at home, or with relationships. Symptoms may look different or at older ages. For example, hyperactivity may appear as extreme restlessness. Symptoms can become more severe when the demands of adulthood increase. Stress, right? For more information about diagnosis and treatment throughout the lifespan, please visit the websites of the National Resource Center on ADHD and the National Institutes of Mental Health. And that concludes their article. So that's kind of a look at the medical model of how they're observing and understanding ADHD and ADD, and the way they approach diagnosing and treating it. I would encourage those of you that are interested in this subject to look at some other approaches and other models of considering what creates ADHD and what could actually help ameliorate those symptoms what could help someone function in a more balanced way in their everyday life. I look upon this as symptoms reflecting how individuals are reacting to or coping with the stresses and challenges of their life and their environment. There are things on multiple levels that can affect this system. So biologically, there are things in our environment that can disturb the brain, the nervous system, and trigger these types of patterns. There's also the social and psychological aspects. So if you have stress in your environment, if there's a lot of conflict in your family, if you have parents who are very punitive or inclined to invalidate you as a child and create or trigger stress for the child or anxiety and insecurity, then that child becomes more vulnerable to drifting or developing these types of patterns. So there's a really important psychological element there that we want to consider. With ADD and ADHD, the education system is significant because that's a big part of the environment for a child. And children are often in an environment where there is a lot of stress or things that make them feel uncomfortable or insecure or anxious. So if a child is surrounded by peers who are, in a sense, bullying or in some way giving negative feedback to that child, then that creates stress and anxiety and discomfort with that environment. So if a child isn't feeling good in that school environment, it's going to be harder for them to want to focus, to want to pay attention in class and so on, because they may be preoccupied with that social stress they're encountering. So the solution there, ideally, is to address that particular stress factor to either help them develop skills for coping with that social stress or to carry them into a different environment, to place them somewhere different where they receive more positive feedback, more support and encouragement, where they feel more motivated to participate in the learning experience. So the school or educational setting plays a powerful role. You will often see children who display the supposed symptoms of ADHD when they're in one school setting and you transfer them to another school setting and suddenly the symptoms go away. So did that child have some genetic or inborn disorder, or were they just reacting and responding to their environment in a way that was creating difficulties? We want to be very cautious and careful about addressing these particular issues, since if we try to medicalize and pathologize their behavior, then we're actually disempowering that child. We're giving them the feedback that there's something wrong with them, that there's a medical disorder that they have, and that they have to be given a particular drug or medication or specialized form of behavior intervention to enable them to be accepted to function in their environment. So we're kind of compounding whatever insecurities that child may have had even before we started to intervene. We want to give children more positive self-worth and self-esteem to validate who they are intrinsically, rather than to convince them, to program them, or in a sense hypnotize them into believing something negative about themselves. So look into the educational aspect, the family environment, all these things that could either nurture and support a child or could create extra or additional stress for them that they might not have the ideal skills yet to handle. Children are developing. They're at a stage where they don't have all the wisdom and understanding and the experience or skills to handle many different stresses. So they will tend to react in whatever way they're able to at that particular stage of development. We can help and support them in guiding them and being role models of creating or developing a wider spectrum of skills. So that's something that we can do to support them, and we can also create environments that are less stressful for them, that don't give them more stress than they're able to process at a given time. That's the role that parents, caregivers, and educators can provide. So there's all these different aspects that we can address without jumping toward giving a prescription that so many people have become attached to. So many people believe that they have a biological disorder, something that's inborn or genetic that's wrong or aberrant with their brain, as they are told to think of it, that they believe they're going to have to take some type of medication for indefinitely or for the rest of their life. When the actual reality and lived experience of millions of people shows that that's not really true. There are many other things we can do that can help us function, that can help us feel less stressed and anxious, that can empower us to manage our state of consciousness and focus so that we can reach the goals we have in life. We can perform in the ways that we're expected to, whether it's at school or at work or at our home. So we have all these resources that could help us, that could empower us to transform. There's the concept of neuroplasticity. With neuroplasticity, we understand that our brain is constantly changing according to what we're thinking, what we're feeling, what we're doing. So it's never set in stone or stuck in a particular state or pattern. We're always changing and evolving, and our brain is continually changing and evolving. So if you think that you need to have a medication and you'll always need to have that medication, you're misunderstanding how our brains actually function. For those that are interested in exploring holistic health and personal growth and spirituality and related topics, I do invite you to visit my website, phinsights.com. That's phinsights.com. For now, I want to wish everyone there watching this a wonderful day. Namaste.